Nick, welcome back to the podcast, man.
Yes, thank you so much for having me on again. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, this is a special one. You guys have just done a project with Barna, some really good in-depth data collection. I think a lot of people are still quoting the stats from Barna's first go at this back in 2016, and so obviously there's a pressing need to get data on this stuff in general. And I love that Pure Desire was able to link arms and pull this off. Can you just tell me a little bit about why you guys made the move specifically to partner with Barna for the study?
Well, you just said it. The data that so many people were quoting, and we work in this area and we go to conferences and we're connected to you and many others that are passionate about helping people. And when we hear them quote data and stats, we knew like, oh, that's from 2016 or that's from the 2012 Covenantized Stat Pack. And while those are very
Right.
interesting data points, our world has changed so much. We've all lived through the COVID pandemic and um, all the things that are happening with gender identity and fluidity. And then on top of that, just seeing that now the generation of kids that grew up with smartphones and high speed internet from really day one are now our young adults and saying, what impact has
Mm,
that had on them? It just really compelled us to say, we need new data and we need to understand what's happening in our world and in churches and among Christians. And I think that was the other piece of what we saw is that for many churches, and I believe the Josh McDowell report with Barna in 2016 was part of it. It felt to us like there was a little bit of a bubble that burst in the church about pornography and the internet and smartphones
yeah.
around the mid 2000, 13, 14, 15, and with the data coming out in 2016. And I think for a lot of churches, it was a bit of a been there, done that moment. Like, oh, we talked about pornography. We ran that series. We did that special event. And now, we've gone on to all these other things. And yet we were convinced, and as the data shows, that things have not improved. We collectively are not moving in the right direction. And
Yeah.
the efforts that we've made in churches to talk about this more, while they're a step in the right direction, have not actually resulted in more people finding freedom and healing in this area. And we
Hmm.
felt confident that the data was going to prove that out, which it did. And so it felt timely and really with that hope to resurface a conversation that we feel so desperately needs to be had at a church level, at a family level, at a community level, to just
Yeah.
answer that question: what's happening with pornography and what impact is it having on us?
Yeah, well, personally, I've already benefited from the work you guys have done because when I'm on podcasts, people are always asking for numbers and stats, and there's lots of numbers and stats out there, but you don't always know where they're coming from. People fudge the numbers a lot, or kind of blow things out of proportion to get their point across. So I'm really grateful to just have reliable data that was vetted properly, that was analyzed properly, and I think it does paint a really clear picture. Like the numbers speak for themselves. We don't really need to exaggerate anything. Can you tell us maybe we can start with just some of the more standard findings, I guess, if you will, around like how local churches are participating or maybe lack thereof, pastor usage, general usage in the church. I'd love to hear some of those, and then maybe we can get into some of the more surprising stats after that.
So I think the question that people ask, at the front is, well, how many people are struggling with pornography? And that question was asked, how often do you view pornography? And people were given the options of daily, weekly, once or twice a month, less often, and never. And so among the general US population, 61% of all adults said that to some degree they are viewing pornography. And then we're able to see that at the local church level among practicing Christians. So for the Barna study, a practicing Christian was someone that on the report self selected that their faith was very important to them and that they attended church on a regular basis.
Oh,
So
wow. Okay.
among practicing Christians, that number is 54%. And to my knowledge, it's the
Wow.
first time any study has shown that a majority of practicing Christians would say, I'm dealing with pornography in my life to some extent. And if you break
Hmm.
that down to male and female, among men, it's 75% of Christian men, but also 40% of Christian women. And
Whoa.
so to have that growing actually at a rate faster than the percentage of men that would say they view pornography, I think continue to underscores how this is not a man's problem. And if in our churches or communities we only talk about how to help men heal, we are
Yeah.
missing 2 in 5 women that say, yeah, me too. This is something I'm dealing with.
Dang.
And in fact, when you can also the beauty of this data and having a group like Barna that does this so well and so professionally, they can keep going down to all the different layers of demographics. So when you look at younger adult women, so millennial women and Gen Z, so millennial women being those particularly in their mid 30s into late 20s, and then Gen Z women in their early to mid 20s, those numbers are much higher. It's 62% and 64% respectively. So for young
Wow.
adult women, nearly 2/3 are saying, I'm struggling with pornography too. And so I hope that's a data point that helps us as leaders, as pastors, as churches say we have a people problem. This isn't
Hmm.
anymore just, well, men are lustful and all men struggle. And some of those, pithy kind of statements we've heard about, well, men are lustful. It's like, no, as human beings, we are all sexual beings made in the image of God to have sexuality as part of our DNA. And we are born into a sinful, fallen world that is deeply sexualized, and it's impacting all of us. And I hope that is one of the data points that just compels people to say, we're going to help all of our people and not just the men who struggle. So I think if that came out of this survey, that would be a tremendous step forward.
Yeah, okay, that's pretty fascinating data, especially the point about women. I feel like anecdotally, I've even experienced that. We have a decent following on Instagram, and we are getting a lot more messages from women asking for help, wanting our resources. And so, we're upfront that, hey, we serve men. There's other places you can check out, and we'll still give the resource. But definitely the local church level, like if they're going to talk about pornography, it happens at the men's breakfast or the men's event, that kind of thing. So that's really, really interesting. One thing I realized, Nick, I probably should have asked this before, asked about specifics, is can you just give a little overview of how this data was collected and how the surveys were conducted, just so that people understand the methods and why this data is so reliable?
Yes, it's the value of doing this with the Barna Group, who, as I mentioned, they're trusted and respected in this area. They've been doing it for decades. Their methodology, I think, has been proven out to consistently be reliable because that's what they do. It's not that we as a ministry went out and asked these questions and there was danger of maybe people having bias. So when Barna asks the question, the survey respondents don't know who is doing the survey, so it's not connected to Pure Desire at all. And in fact, I think the way it's conducted, they don't even know why Barna is asking these questions, like what their hopeful outcome is. So they've really
Hmm.
perfected a method that is intended to get the most honest responses. The surveys are done completely anonymously, and in any point, people could opt out to say, I don't feel comfortable asking that question, answering that question. And that was one of the things Barna said to us. They were very surprised at how few people opted out, even of the more personal questions about someone's personal pornography use. It was
Hmm.
only 2 or 3% that said they would prefer not to answer. So the
Oh, wow.
surveys were done anonymously in a way that produces very reliable feedback. And another thing that Barna emphasizes is doing qualitative research, not quantitative. So I think sometimes in data, we try to impress people with, we asked 100,000 people. When the truth is, if you've not asked the right people in the right way, you might actually be getting more of a bias than you realize, or you may just be getting more of the answers that you've already received. And so Barna is able to do the survey in a way that they look at, we want a male female audience, we want young and old, we want different ethnicities, we want different levels of connection to church or faith community. And they
Yeah.
have all these metrics of how many people need to respond within that demographic and from that part of the country, that they know once we've heard from enough respondents in that demographic, we've pretty much got the data and we can keep asking more and more people, but we're just going to get more of the answers we've already got. And so
Hmm.
I think in total, like if people look at the fine print, and I would really encourage them to pick up a copy of the report. It's about a 120-page report filled with far more data than you and I can cover today. But it's fascinating. It's insightful. It's called Beyond the Porn Phenomenon. And you can see all the fine print about their methodology, how many people it represents. In the back, in the glossary, they explain a lot of it. I think in total, the survey asked about 2,600 people, which
Okay.
for some listeners might feel like, well, that's small. I heard that so-and-so asked 20,000 people. And it's like, well, great, but those are quantitative methods where this
Hmm.
is about the quality of
Yeah.
responses and the demographics covered. So honestly, that's why we worked with Barna to do it, because we're not researchers. We didn't want to delve into a new field to get this. We knew that Barna had done it before and felt that there was also tremendous value in the report that came out in 2016. This was done by the same group in a lot of the same ways. So there are a number of control questions that were asked in 2016 and were then
Ah,
asked 7 years later to compare how are we doing. And in many of those categories, that's where we're able to very definitively say things have progressed in a negative way. Things are getting worse because the same company doing the same survey, asking the same questions, can show that 7 years ago, here's how people responded compared to today. So all that is in the report, and I think gives confidence to the numbers we're talking about.
yeah, yeah, really, really helpful. So let's go back to the data points that you were sharing. So 75% of I forget the language you're using now, but Christian men,
Yeah,
people that are take their faith
practicing
seriously,
men.
practicing Christians. Thank you. Yeah. So 75% say that pornography is a struggle to some extent, or they're viewing, and presumably most people that are practicing Christians would actually shape it as a struggle, compared to the other stat you said, which I think was 61% of men just in general admit that pornography is they viewed to some extent. Is there a time frame on that? Like how long ago, or just at some point in their life?
It would be within the last. I think the question encourages you to think about your life currently and how frequently are you viewing pornography. So if someone goes, well, it's been a couple of months, then they would have answered less often than those who answered, once or twice a month. So
Okay,
it gives a
right.
snapshot of where someone is currently at. And we also defined pornography in the questions because I think that was something that 7 years
Hmm.
ago was perhaps missed. It allowed people to define pornography on their own terms. And many people, yeah, and this came out in the data again, many people do not define a naked image intended to create sexual arousal as pornography any longer. But
Oh, because
within
it's
the
not
way
a
we asked the
video?
question, we said if it's an image, video, or something in reading material that is intended to be sexually explicit and arousing, that's pornography. And so that's what the number is
Hmm.
based off of. But yeah, there's some pretty convicting, compelling answers that the line of what people in general would consider pornography keeps moving up to. Essentially, for most people, it's like unless it's hardcore video porn, we don't think of it as pornography any longer,
Wow.
which is very frightening to think about the amount of images that are on, social media sites, and people go, oh, well, that's not a problem, is it? That's just our world. It's like, no, that's having the same impact on your brain, on the reward cycle, on what it's doing to your hormones and chemicals, and creating challenges with real people and real relationships.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot there to look into.
Anything else that you said? Because you kind of mentioned at large, we can say that in general, things have progressively gotten worse since the last round of data collection with Barna in 2016. What other trends did you guys observe from this round?
Well, you see the increase in the number of women using pornography as well among pastors that acknowledge that it is a current struggle. So it's now
Hmm.
1 in 5, or about 20% of pastors say this is something they are actively struggling with personally. Where I think
Okay.
7 years ago, that was more in the
It's 1 in 7 or something,
14,
right?
15%, if I remember. And then
Right.
a majority of pastors acknowledge this has been a struggle in their life at some point, that it's something they've dealt with. And that number has also grown.
Hmm.
Uh, I'm off the top of my head not thinking what were the other comparative numbers, but they are in the report. We
Yeah.
spent more time in this report asking about the impact it's having on relationships, the
Okay.
impact it's having on a person's mental well-being, and delved a little deeper into what steps people are taking to get help or to pursue healing and recovery. And so, some of the surprising data that came out was finding that 84% of people, when asked who is helping you in your struggle with pornography, 84% said no one.
Wow.
That among all the options of a spouse, a friend, a pastor, a
Right.
counselor, the vast majority just said no one. And then another question was asked, who even knows that you are viewing pornography? And again, all the options were given, from family to friend to coworker to counselor. 49% of all people, and this was among those who had already answered, yes, I'm viewing pornography to some degree.
Right.
49% said nobody knows. And so we would hope that in the faith community, among practicing Christians, that number would be significantly better, but it's only 1 percentage point better. 48% of practicing Christians said no one knows. And those are two pretty huge stats that can be discouraging, but I actually look at those as a silver lining for what you and I do and for what I believe the church is called to do, because
Yeah.
it's a very, in my opinion, straightforward solution to say if 84% of people said no one is helping them, what if we
Yeah.
offered help? What if wide
Yes.
scale people knew there are people here to help me? And if half of people basically say no one even knows, how do we create environments where it's safe to come forward and not have to stand in front of the whole church and raise your hand and say, yeah, I'm going to that group? But in
Yeah.
safe, confidential places, where could people go and just have someone else know about their struggle? I mean, those are two pretty straightforward things that I think churches and families are well equipped to do, that could make a huge difference in people's struggle, because so many right now say, I don't have that. And I
Yeah.
simply ask the question, what if they did have that? What if they had help? What if they had freedom to be real? What difference would we see in the number of people who struggle?
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. I was thinking, man, I'm going to make sure my team listens to this interview because I think it really depicts why pure desire is so important in today's day and age, why what we do has a place as well, because I think there is clearly a growing need for it. If I'm remembering correctly, one stat that I did see improved very, very marginally, mind you, but was at least positive is I think it was 93% of local churches in 2016 didn't have any kind of program or resource material for people struggling. And I think that number's 90% from the new round of data. Is that correct? Did that one at least get
That's
slightly
correct.
better?
We've seen a 3% growth. And, I say it a little bit tongue in cheek. Growth is
Yeah.
good in any way in that area, to say, hey, more churches are realizing we need to have a plan. We need to have a strategy. The number of people that struggle, mandates that we do something to say there's a pathway to healing. But when you look at the numbers that we've already discussed, to know that 90% of churches still would say, we don't have a plan. One of
Yeah.
the other questions that was asked both to the general population and to pastors. And so pastors were asked, does your church have a plan to help people in this area of pornography? 37% of pastors said, I don't know. And I found
Wow.
that
Hmm.
alarming, that their answer would be, oh, I don't know. Because if you don't know as the pastor, that's a no, right?
Yeah.
If you don't
Yeah.
know, then your people really don't know.
Yeah.
And I think that indicates, maybe that there's a hopefulness that, well, maybe somewhere in our recovery team or our counselor handles that. I don't really know. It just, I think,
Hmm.
shows a little level of apathy or lack of awareness around a topic that really you and I probably would agree should be in 100% of churches. That if
Yeah.
54% of people who sit in a chair or a pew on a weekly basis say, this is in my life, why are we not offering something in every church? And so,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm grateful to see growth, but probably compared to the problem, and I think we keep seeing this, that in our culture, the sexuality of our culture, the availability of explicit content, the access that we have at any age and stage of life is growing exponentially, and the
Hmm.
church's response has grown 3%. And I love the church, and I've been a pastor. I'm an ordained pastor to this day. I just look at that number and say, we can do better. We have to
Yeah.
do better. And part of that
Yes.
is because of my deep conviction that the body of Christ has all of the tools. We have all of the skills needed to
Yeah.
make a tremendous difference in this area. I mean, we are the people of grace and compassion. We are people that understand truth and forgiveness. We are people that understand the empowerment of the Holy Spirit to live in victory. And we understand the power of community, the one another's of the gospel and of the Bible, that we're called to do life together. I mean, those are four essential elements of recovery. So the church
Hmm.
has the tools. We often just haven't put them into the hands of people in this area specifically. So I'm convicted, and I just wish 100% of churches shared that conviction, because it would be a game changer.
Yeah, it's a big one. And I do want to talk maybe about some solutions the local church could be employing, those other 90% who don't have anything. But I want to ask a couple more questions about what you shared. You mentioned a little bit more question asking around the impact of pornography on relationships and mental wellness. I'd love to hear some of the findings there as well.
Yeah, this is an area I'd really encourage people to grab the report so you can see it, because it is visually striking to me. There were a number of questions that people were asked in regards to unhealthy mental practices, things like, how often are you experiencing anxiety, being very critical towards self, depression, thoughts of self harm. And they correlated that then to people's answers with how much or how often they view pornography. And you can see across the board that the more pornography someone views, the more unhealthy they were in their mental health. So the
Wow.
more pornography you view, the more likely you are to say, I'm experiencing anxiety, depression, I'm very self-critical, and thoughts of self-harm. Now, we don't know if that's correlation or causation. Does the pornography cause those negative effects, or does the negative effects cause us to go to pornography? I
Sure.
look at that though and say, well, either way, it shows there's a connection. Whether it's causation or correlation, it's connected. That
Yeah.
if we're going to help people in areas like anxiety and depression and suicidal ideation, helping them understand their battle with pornography is a significant part of it. And then on the inverse, we asked people about signs of positive mental health, of like, I feel a sense of well-being, of purpose, I feel connected to others. And it's the same. It's the inverse, that the more pornography someone is viewing, the less healthy they felt on those questions. So that's
Hmm.
why I say I hope you grab the report, because when you look at the images, it's like it's just everyone. It's like this consistent line that shows the more pornography use, the more unhealth. The more pornography use, the less health. And
Man.
I again hope that's part of our wake up call to say this isn't just an isolated problem, because I think sometimes that's how we want to treat it. Like, yeah, there are a few people that have that problem, and it's kind of just this one area of their life, but overall, people are good, right? And I think there is, and even in churches and in our communities, a growing sense that, man, someone's mental well-being is deeply tied to their spiritual well-being. And we need to
Yeah.
help people experience health and maturity and freedom in these areas. Well, if we can see that their sexuality, their issues with pornography are deeply tied to that as well, I think it might help us take a more holistic approach to recovery and not just see it as an isolated incident or issue for a few people, but really bring it into that whole conversation to just say, how are we helping people grow? How are we helping people mature? How are we discipling people to be more like Christ? Because if that's our goal, which I believe it is, then helping people in this area of their pornography struggle is a part of that equation, because it's all connected.
It's such a good point, and it's just interesting to me that everyone's talking about depression and anxiety. That's getting tons of press time, and I think people are aware this is a problem, but no one's talking about how pornography has some sort of role in it. Like you said, whether it's causal or it's just correlative, it still is. It's worth noting, and I mean, definitely in our clients, I'm sure you guys witness this in your programs as well. When people get out pornography, the brain fog disappears, they're more positive and happy about life. They have a lot more control over their emotional regulation. They're not as anxious and wiry, as it were. So that data just makes sense to me. But at the same time, I feel like this is a part of the conversation around mental illness that often gets lost in all of it. Any data comparing that with like general population, local church on that front, or was that not segmented?
In the report, it's not. I mean, we could pull out those numbers, but I wouldn't have those
Sure.
right now with me. But yeah, I mean, we could
Okay.
find that.
Yeah, yeah. No, I was just curious. What about the relationship side of it? What kind of data started to emerge there?
Some of the things that came out, questions were asked of men and women. If your spouse was viewing pornography in the relationship, do you see that as a positive experience or negative? But men, a majority, I think it's 61%, said that it was very positive or somewhat positive that their spouse was using pornography. So most
Oh,
men thought, oh, this was a good thing,
hmm.
versus well over half of women, I think it was 55%, said that it was a very negative or a somewhat negative experience if their spouse was using pornography. And I think it does underscore some gender differences where men perhaps were introducing or encouraging pornography use in the relationship because they believed it would lead to more sex, more variety of sex, more passion. And perhaps in the short run, it even worked. And it
Hmm.
created an environment, because pornography, as I'm sure you've talked about on your podcast, as we have on ours, part of why it's so ubiquitous and enslaving is because it's so effective. Like, it
Yeah.
creates all kinds of brain chemicals and things that are firing off, and a heightened experience that in that moment might have been like, wow, this was a great thing, but it's not sustainable. It always demands more. It always creates unrealistic expectations. And so I think men responded more to the, hey, this spiced up our sex life for a while, where the
Yeah.
female said, no, this was a negative thing. And there are then a lot of follow-up questions about what impact did your spouse's pornography use have on you? And in comparing women to men, women were far more likely to say It caused them to feel like they were being used by their spouse, like they weren't valued. It caused them to question their own self-worth or if they were beautiful. And you just see these huge differences. And so
Hmm.
it's caused me to wonder a little bit if our response to pornography is in some ways muted, because if we're honest, most Christian churches and organizations are led by men who, even if we're not actively struggling with pornography, we are in the demographic that tends to see pornography as less destructive, less negative for a
Hmm.
relationship. And those that we talk to, other men, maybe share some of that opinion. Oh, is it that big of a deal? Is it really that harmful? Whereas if we were willing to listen to more of the voices of the spouse, of women who are saying, this did not help our relationship, it did not help me, it left me in a vulnerable place, we might see more change in the area. And then one other
Hmm.
data point, and I should have had the numbers in front of me, but could get the exact stats if you wanted to post them later or put them in. Um, Men and women were asked, if there was pornography in your relationship, has your relationship healed? And women were far more likely to say it has not healed, that our relationship has not recovered. And I believe it was at a rate of 3 to 1, that women were 3 times more likely to say, no, we have not recovered, where men were saying, we're doing fine. So you can
Hmm.
see a lot of that come out in the data, just the experience that men have around the use of pornography and women.
That's actually fascinating. So it sounds like men are maybe in some ways a little bit blind to the impact, but then also, like you said, at that first data point, they just don't seem to be as affected by it. Like they just think this is a good thing or it's not really causing that much harm, I guess, in relative terms. Whereas it sounds like women are much more aware. I mean, that again, that would definitely check out anecdotally from what we've seen in the spouses of our clients and the women that we
For
interact with
sure.
online on Instagram and that kind of thing.
It
So
underscores, if I could jump in, it underscores what we
please.
know about addiction in general, is that for the ones struggling, there is an active process in the brain of rationalizing the behavior,
Yeah.
minimizing its impact, and denying that we have a problem. And those structures, we don't choose actively to do those things, but it is a byproduct of our brain trying to help us navigate, why do we keep choosing this thing that we don't want and that it seems to have unhealthy consequences in our life, but we
Yeah.
keep doing it. And so our brain responds to try to lower how we feel. And that's the minimizing, the denying, the rationalizing. And I think the data just shows that no, this has a tangible impact on how people view pornography and their relationship, because the one struggling goes, oh, is it really that big of a deal? And I don't think it was that bad. And again, we see it in the people we work with that, yeah, that happens. But now the data shows this is coming out in the way people feel about it. And it's something to really
Hmm.
take note of.
Well, yeah, I mean, if 61% of men in general are watching pornography to some extent, and then a similar number are basically saying, yeah, it's fine. My spouse watching is a good thing, or it's not a harmful thing. Like you can kind of just start to see like how this narrative all intersects and intertwines with each other. So anything else about relationships that the data showed that was interesting, and like because even the recovered part is quite revealing as well. And we hear a lot of stories of guys who quit pornography and then they kind of go back to their wife like, ta-da, I took care of it. And meanwhile, the spouse still does not trust them, doesn't believe that they're free. Like there's all those other issues that they just thought would go away once they quit porn. So I think that checks out. Anything else, Nick, that you think is worth highlighting there?
Some of the data that we haven't addressed yet that I think does lean towards relationships and reemphasizes some of this idea of we'd prefer just to move on. We asked the question, who do you feel comfortable talking to about issues with pornography? And there was a long list of people that were up there, and the number one answer was a counselor. And that might
Hmm.
make sense because I think as a culture we have established that, hey, that's who you go to with a problem, you go talk to a counselor.
Yeah.
But I also think it highlights that we primarily see this as something that you deal with privately and outside of your normal relationships, because the number two answer was your
Hmm.
doctor. Again, a
Oh,
professional that
wow.
you go to who's outside of your circle of friends, outside of your family network. Go talk to them privately, talk about your issues, get advice, and then kind of come back into your normal world, and navigate things there. And so I think spouse was fourth or fifth on that list. and someone's pastor was like ninth on the list. And when it
Oh,
came to pastor, like, do you feel comfortable going to your pastor? Only 11% of people said they would be comfortable going to their pastor. So those weren't directly about relationships, but it shows that overall, we just treat this as an issue that we'd prefer not to talk about. And if we do talk about it, we'd prefer to go to someone that doesn't
right.
really know us, but it's their
Yeah.
job to help us. So that's good. It's good to get help. I don't want to in any way discourage someone from going to a counselor or a doctor. Those are people with tremendous skills. But as you and I have seen so frequently in this area, healing and recovery is about relationships and connection. And you can have a great doctor, but I'm going to tell you, your relationship with your doctor is not the kind of relationship you need to experience healing. It's with people that
Yeah.
know you, that are doing life with you. And we need to just continue to encourage that those more and more need to be the places where we go to have these conversations.
I guess I'm really intrigued by just the disparity in people wanting to getting help from the local church, and even I guess this is kind of reinforcing the same data point, isn't it? That only 11% would actually talk to their pastors about it. So what do you make of that? Is it that churches aren't talking about it even from the pulpit to begin with, and that's I guess that's maybe the first part of it, and obviously then the second part is on the back end. There's no discipleship or no offering. Is that the narrative there, or what do you think is going on in the local church?
I wish it was a straightforward answer. I think that's one of those, there's a number of possibilities, and what you brought up is definitely part of it. In most churches, this is a taboo topic. It's just not brought up, or when it's brought up primarily through the lens of this is a sinful behavior, including, and here's all the things that are bad, and why we shouldn't do them. And so if that's the only context in which I hear about it, well, of course, I'm going to feel a little hesitant or shameful to go and acknowledge, well, I'm doing this bad, sinful thing, versus talking about sexuality from the perspective of wholeness and God's creation and God's goodness, and how the enemy is trying to steal and rob God's goodness in this area by selling us false narratives. And so having those level of conversations, and for people to see, testimonies of life change, to hear about a safe group where they could confidentially go for help. Most people just aren't hearing that at all. And so I think it does show some of the hesitancy. One other thing that came up, and this was illuminating for me as a leader in this area, of a sexual integrity ministry, people were asked, how comfortable are you with your pornography use? So again, for those that responded that they are viewing pornography to some degree, they were asked a couple of follow-up questions, and one was, how comfortable are you? And the answers were, I wish I didn't use pornography at all. I wish I used less pornography, or I'm comfortable with how much pornography I use. And among practicing Christians, only 21% said, I wish I didn't use pornography at all. So 79% of people were either comfortable or somewhat comfortable with how much pornography they were viewing. And I think that
Wow.
reveals that the problem isn't just that churches are not talking about it and pastors are difficult to approach. I think it goes back to what we said about some of these denial and rationalizing and minimizing structures in our brain, that when we've had a problem that we're dealing with for a while and we've been unsuccessful to change or stop it, I think we're left with two options. We're left with feeling like I have to keep trying and there's something wrong with me because I really want to be free. Or the other option is I change the standard. And I think, frankly, we've seen a lot of that, where what's happening in our culture, where sexualization is just so common, what we see on social media and in movies, just, sexuality is just kind of part of our world. I think to some degree we've embraced that in Christianity to say, well, a little bit, is it that big of a deal? Is it really harming people? It's not great, but it's not happening that often. Maybe every couple of months I stray into something, but mostly things are okay. And I think
Yeah.
we're seeing that attitude and that question. And I've often used the metaphor of if someone came to us and the topic was using meth, and they said, well, I'm not using meth that much. I mean, it's once or twice a month. And, when I do, I don't hurt anybody. It's just, I'm doing it privately at home. None of us would say to that person, oh, I'm sure you're fine. Yeah, that's not a big deal. We would say,
Right.
man, this is potentially life altering. Like, this is dangerous. It's progressive in nature. You're going to want to come back to it. It's altering the structures of your brain. Like, we would encourage, there is no level of meth that is healthy for you to be engaging in. And
Mm.
yet, because it's this topic of our sexuality and misaligned sexuality, I think we're seeing this embracing of a viewpoint that just says, well, is it really that big of a deal? And I think it's at our heart because we don't know how to change, or we don't know if we can be free. So it's
Yeah.
a little bit of that idea of, rather than fight them, let's join them. And if we can just kind of manage our sin and not let it get too out of control, we're okay. And yet we are tragically seeing, it feels like every week, another Christian leader or a respected name in Christianity that's being exposed for something in their life that they probably minimized or tried to hide for a long time. And then we all
Hmm.
see that and go, oh my goodness, how could that happen? Well,
Yeah.
they're just a
Right.
byproduct of this whole system where we don't know how to talk about it. We're minimizing its impact, and we're trying to say, well, it's not that big of a deal. Where we
Yeah.
need to, I think, step back and go, man, this is a big deal. And it does start with churches, I think, being more open about it, but it also starts at that heart level of saying, have I come to a place as an individual where I've accepted this as more okay than really I should be? Um,
Hmm.
because I think if we could come back to saying, you know what, I want to fight for freedom. I want to fight believing I don't have to have this in my life at all. I want to hold on to that conviction.
Yeah.
Then I
Yeah.
think we have the motivation to take the steps we need to move towards freedom. So I just thought that was a really compelling data piece. And like I shared with my team at Pure Desire, I said, we might be a little susceptible to our own ministry here, because the people that do come to help, they're in that 21%. The people that
Yeah.
reach out are probably saying, I wish this wasn't in my life at all. And we
Hmm.
assume that everyone's in that category because those are the people we hear from. But the truth is, a majority of even Christians really aren't that bothered. And so, we don't want to go out with, bats and hit them over the head and say, shame on you, stop that. But it
Yeah.
is helping us to ask the question, how do we present a more beautiful picture of life without pornography, of a world
Yeah.
without this kind of brokenness in my life? Because I think if we could create a stronger desire that people say, you know what, I want that, and I actually believe it's possible, we would see a lot more people moving towards recovery.
I almost wonder if there's an opposing, like, yeah, an opposing side of it. I guess one side is we're minimizing it, we're justifying it. It's a little bit here, at least it's not as bad as so and so. And so it kind of gets dismissed. And maybe the other side of it is that, in at least, and I've heard this even said in some groups, where everyone's struggling and nobody has a solution. And it's like, oh yeah, this pornography, like that's, everybody's got that problem, but people just can't figure it out. We don't know what we're doing. And there's it's almost like it's so hopeless that people don't even bother trying to do something about it. It's just like, yeah, this is just my thing. It's my thorn in the flesh, or, whatever it is. But it's everybody else's thorn in the flesh too. I mean, porn's everywhere and we're all struggling.
Right.
And I know it's certainly part of the vision here at Deep Clean, is we're really dreaming about really releasing to the world men who are modeling integrity and setting an example and showing people, hey, this is possible. It doesn't matter what you've been through, or, how bad situations might be. Like God can meet you there, and he can bring incredible freedom. Because I think without that role model, without that example, without some semblance of hope. I mean, I love your guys' podcast. I love what you guys do, and you really broadcast a lot of stories of hope. And I think the world needs more of that to know it's possible. Because if you don't know it's possible, then you will fall into the 79% who just say, yeah, this is what it is, and they're melancholy about it for one reason or another. Did the data? Because I've gone through the report, but admittedly, you said it's 120 pages. I think I definitely don't remember all of it, and there's some parts I just didn't catch. The pandemic, I know that took place obviously between the two data collection rounds, 2016 and 2024. Did you guys have any insights or even just any implications about how the pandemic might have affected porn usage?
In the end, we decided not to ask questions specifically about that time period, partly because it is now, for many of us, we think of that as 2, 3, or 4 years ago, and it's often not a valuable data collection point to try to have someone remember how they felt 3 or 4 years ago.
Makes sense. Yeah.
But I think some of the things we've already talked about, we would acknowledge the ways in which COVID and the pandemic and places being shut down, having less social interaction, was detrimental to relationships, because it put us online, it put us in isolation, it kept us from places where we could have someone know about our struggle. Now, unfortunately, the two questions we also talked about, does anyone know about your pornography use, and is anyone helping you? Those were not asked 7 years ago, because I would wonder if those numbers have grown quite a bit, where In isolation, we developed some patterns. And because we weren't going maybe to church in person or meeting with people as frequently, it just kind of got shoved under the surface. And so now we see half of people saying, yeah, no one even knows about this
Mm,
problem that developed in my life. No one's helping me. I'm trying to figure it out on my own. So I think we're seeing the results of it without having asked specifically about that time period, that people
yeah.
are more isolated, they feel more alone, and they don't feel comfortable going to anyone. And I think that is some of what happened over the last 3 or 4 years in our culture.
That I would agree, and I think that makes a lot of sense. What would you say? Because I imagine you've been talking about the data ad nauseum since you guys released it to the public. You're obviously very familiar with everything. Have you thought at all about, has it influenced what you guys are doing at Pure Desire? Have you thought about what solutions do you think naturally could be crafted from some of the data points, or what would you be dreaming about in 2025 and beyond if the public had, the perfect response to all of this data and everything it's telling? What do you think it would look like?
One of the surprising points of data that came out in a number of the questions when you compared, like people who said, I wish I didn't use pornography at all. I want my church to be talking about this. I think pornography is harmful for our society. In all those questions and several others like them, Gen Z, so our younger men and youngest adults, those 18 to 25,
Hmm.
their numbers were actually a little bit better than millennials. And so those of us, and I'm right at the tail end of millennial Gen X, kind of category. Those
Okay.
of us that grew into the internet age, as we went into adulthood and kind of had all this come on us without much warning or have people having experienced it ahead of us, are in many ways the group that has been the most deeply impacted. But we're seeing some signs of hope in Gen Z, that young adults, and I think then because of that, teenagers. And I would add as an aside, we didn't end up asking questions of teenagers because there are a number of laws that have been changed that prevent a teen from self-incriminating. And even in an anonymous survey, a lot of questions they would be answering about pornography would actually be a self-incriminating response. So we can only infer from young adults, those 18 to 25, what our teens might also be experiencing. But I think it's
Hmm.
some signs of hopefulness that our youngest adults are seeing the negative impact. They want to talk about it more. They want their churches to talk about it, and they want help. And I think if we listen to those voices and we say, man, let's help there, I do believe it could have a kind of a trickle down effect, or a trickle up effect, if you will, that when a
Yeah.
church says, you know what, we want to help young adults because we see it. Like we see, if you're a teen, if you're a college student in today's world, like it's everywhere. You're going to be exposed to it. We want to help you be resilient, have safe places to talk about it, have tools and strategies in place, and you started to implement that. Then some of those leaders and in your church, people are going to go, well, wait a minute, why don't we all use that? Well, that seems like a really powerful tool, or that process of breaking free. I think I could benefit from that. And if we see that need and accompanied with that desire of our young adults saying, please help me, please talk about this, and we say, okay, we're going to do it. I think it could ultimately impact all the generations above them
Yeah.
because we're willing to address these things. So that makes me hopeful. And I think was actually one of the surprises of the data, that we might just expect, okay, it's bad in Gen X, it's really bad for millennials, and it's terrible for Gen Z. And
Yeah.
in some regard, like the exposure to pornography and the amount of use, Gen Z is the highest. But in some of
Okay.
those more hopeful categories of the response, Gen Z is a little bit ahead, saying we want to see a different way. And so I hope we hear that and listen to that, and in really helping that generation, we actually begin to help all the generations.
That is really encouraging. Very, very interesting. And if you don't mind me asking, what was the rough age of or average age of first exposure for Gen Z? Did you guys have that in the study there?
Yeah, that was not again asked in this survey, and
Oh,
the
okay. I
understanding
think I
was
missed that. Sorry.
because we weren't asking people of that age. We didn't try to have them remember when was it, but I think we've seen that has been asked in a lot of studies, that 9 to 11 years old is still kind of the most common response. But as
Yes.
you've probably seen, I'm hearing more and more frequently the grade school ages come up, just because grade schoolers have tablets and smartphones
Yeah.
and access to things they shouldn't. And in curiosity, they're being exposed to content they shouldn't see. So it's increasingly going younger.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, yeah, no, that makes sense for sure. The one thing that I'm kind of the most surprised by is how few people have a place to go, just to talk to somebody about it. Like how many people are still bottled up inside with their struggle and I guess don't have that safe place. It kind of encourages me to think that if we can even find solutions there, that could actually get a lot of people at least one step into the room of recovery, whatever that looks like, because that first step is often the hardest. What do you make of the data from a solutions perspective at a deeper level? So we know like most people don't have a place to go. So, provide that avenue, provide that forum. And then on the back end, people are going deeper into recovery. Any insights from the data that would make you say, it sounds like people are looking for this in their solution or looking for this to be part of what helps them break free. Any pieces along those lines, either explicitly or implicitly?
One of the areas that I would think about is how in a couple of questions, when people were asked in different ways about solutions, where do you go, who do you turn to, the one I mentioned, who do you feel comfortable talking to, the number one answer pretty consistently was a counselor, and then that the other one, the doctor. I think what it reveals is we have a mindset that says this is a really big problem, go and talk to a professional. And while there's some truth to that, while professionals have a role to play and definitely a level of equipping where they might bring that expertise, I think it shows, again, maybe a hidden silver lining to what the pathway to healing is. When so many people say, no one is helping me, no one even knows, they don't need a professional for that. They just need someone equipped enough to have some basic understanding here, to have a heart to help, to have an ear to listen, and to say, I'm with you in this. You're not alone. And I'm not here to, judge, punish, and condemn you over this behavior. I want to help and support you, believing that there is a better path, and we're going to be a part of walking that with you. And I think if people were hearing that from their churches, if kids were hearing that from their parents, and not just getting a, hey, go talk to a counselor, that would be a tremendous move in the right direction. As I was saying earlier, these are not hard things to do, to create safe spaces, to start conversations. But sometimes we don't start those conversations because we don't feel equipped at all. And I think that's a part of the solution, whether we're a parent or a leader or just a concerned adult in the church. We need to be educated in this a little bit, to understand the brain and what's happening in addiction and the neurochemicals. And we don't have to become an expert, but if we have a little bit of understanding that this is a brain problem, and that's not minimizing our choices, or that's not trying to deny that it's sinful and evil behavior, but it's recognizing there's more going on than just someone choosing to sin. They're giving into some patterns that have been developed often over decades in their life, and that have been reinforced by actual chemicals that can be seen in the brain. It just gives us a broader perspective for healing than, well, just don't do that. We'll stop, stop going there. Yeah. So many people, I think, have heard that and said, that's what I'm trying to do. And I can't seem to stop. And then they just conclude this shame. Well, there must be something wrong with me because I know I should stop and I want to stop, but I can't stop. So it must be me. But if we can help them see some of what's happened in their brain and their pattern and why they're doing this, the big why questions, man, there's so much healing and freedom that's possible. So that's where I think getting a little equipped, and what we're trying to do at Pure Desire is provide those resources to parents and leaders and churches to say, you don't have to become the counselor, but if you feel a little bit equipped, then you often have the confidence to go to someone and just say, hey, how can I help? Or as a parent, if we don't even know where to start the conversation, it is tough to bring up with our teenage kid or even our 10, 11, 12-year-old, because it should be starting earlier. Yeah. But if we've read a book, listened to a podcast, gone through a video series, and we have a little bit more courage then to just say, hey, I've been reading this book about pornography, or I listened to this talk someone gave, and I'm curious, how could I be more supportive of you? How could I be helpful? That might be a tremendous starting point. So I think the data would suggest, again, people are looking for help, but if we're going to provide the help, we need to have a little bit of confidence that we have something to say and aren't just going to blunder into an area where we're clueless of how to help.
Yeah, for sure. Or resort to maybe some of the old messages, which is like, don't have sex before marriage, don't watch porn, and that's it, and protect your purity at all costs. Like you said, you don't need a PhD to really be informed enough to be able to provide some value. Just understanding the basics and the right framework and kind of perspective to have can go a long way, and can create that safety. I mean, people ask me very often, especially when I go and speak, parents will come up and say, what do I do? Like my kids watching, or, they have young kids and they don't want them to fall into it. And I feel like again, I'm a young parent. Like I don't pretend to be an expert in the area, but all the people I've heard and interviewed on my podcast to even ask the same questions, like most of it revolves around just being a safe person, being able to just have that conversation safely without judgment. And if you can provide some guidance or steer someone in the right direction, they'll thank you forever. Like it doesn't take much. And I know you guys are big on that. I mean, even in my local church, there's a bunch of guys that are all Pure Desire trained. They've done the groups. Some of them are running groups. And I feel like I've seen that just across the board. You guys have done a really tremendous job trying to curb that stat. I think if things went from 93 to 90% in the local church, Pure Desire probably is solely or at least largely responsible for that. You guys have been so great at resourcing. So I think that is amazing, Nick. And for people who do want to find more resources on the parenting front or local church front or anything else we've discussed, what would be some good places for them to do that with you guys?
Well, I appreciate those words of encouragement, and we're doing what we can because we feel called into this area, and that we know God wants to bring people freedom more than we do. So we're just trying to say, how can we help be a part of that? To answer your question, I want to give one more stat. We asked youth pastors and youth leaders, who do they think should be equipping teens for healthy sexuality? And overwhelmingly, mom and dad were the number one answer. Over 90% were saying mom and dad should be the number one answer. But then they were asked the question, who do you think is educating teens about sexuality? The top three answers: social media, friends, and pornography.
Wow.
And that to me is, for our teens, like, and I think we all would probably agree, would go, yep, it's probably true. We think it should be in the home, but it's probably the internet and pornography and what their friends are saying. Yeah. So how could we bring that gap down? And you clip moms and dads, because the benefit that moms and dads have are they are there from day one. They don't step into their teen's life like social media might or a friend might. They're there from day one to create that environment of safety, of support, of openness, saying, hey, if you struggle, I want to help you with this. I want you to know you can come to me. So we've created some resources for parents, for youth leaders. Everything can be found at puredesire.org. That's our website. That's the starting point. We just recently released a new resource for youth leaders, but it would be valuable for parents as well, called the Youth Leader Library. And it is a library of 25 or so videos of our team in quick 3 to 5 minute videos training on how to teach about godly biblical sexuality with teenagers. And so you could walk through everything from where do we find sexuality in the Bible, to what's a biblical response to masturbation, to what about dating and boundaries there, and just hear from our team that spend a lot of time thinking about these topics to equip you or the youth leader in your church to have better conversations. And we made that free because we think it's just a starting point that everyone would benefit from. And then one other thing we recently developed is a parent training course. We have a couple on our team named Rodney and Tracy Wright that wrote a book, How to Talk with Your Kids About Sex. So it's how to talk with your kids, because the key is all about the environment of we're with our kids in this. Well, we took that book and they're teaching, so they're the primary presenters on a video course, our parent training course, how to equip parents to have better conversations with their kids about sex. And it's a 10-week course or a 10-session course that parents, churches, small groups could walk through just to equip all of us to have those better conversations. And so you can find that at puredesire.org. And I think that would be a great starting point, because for a lot of people, the primary thing we do is help people start groups, long-term recovery groups for healing and sobriety. But that can be difficult to know. How do we go from nothing to launching a group? But to watch some videos training youth leaders, that's easy to do. To take parents through a course at a minimal cost, well, that's pretty easy to start. And then ultimately that might create the momentum to launching groups in your church or community, which would then be what we're here to help with.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think the parent one, the youth pastor / parent one or youth leader, that's a really big deal, because I have to imagine, the reason pastors don't bring this conversation to the local church is, as the stats have revealed, they probably had their own struggle, maybe are having their own struggle. There's probably a degree of not wanting to feel like a hypocrite and, or, not having enough mastery in this area for them to feel comfortable to broach the subject congregationally. And I think in the home, the very similar thing is happening where parents know they should be having the conversations and want to, but maybe they're still even figuring it out themselves. So I think this is awesome that you guys have these resources, and it's also good impetus for those fathers, especially that are listening, and mothers, as now we've learned from the data, that might be struggling with pornography themselves, to really get the help they need also. Because you just never know how you getting that freedom could maybe change things for your kids and your family and your lineage. So, Nick, this has been amazing. We'll put the link in the show notes there for people to check out your stuff. But thank you so much for the work you're doing. Thanks for all the time and energy and resources it took to put this study together. Very, very grateful, and nice to have a new, fresh set of data that I can start reporting here on the podcast as well.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me on to talk about it and to put a spotlight on this data, which we hope then creates the momentum and the motivation for action and for change.
Absolutely. Thanks again, man. Appreciate it.